So this is a video that I've been wanting to make for a long time, and it probably deserves something much more than a 8 or 9 or 10 minute video treatment, but I'm going to give it a shot, all right? Now, so many of you have been over the years commenting or saying that the Fed is a private corporation, okay? The Fed is part of the federal government. All right, and I'm going to go over all the reasons why that is true. Number one, the Federal Reserve was created by an act of Congress in 1913, the Federal Reserve Act, which spells out exactly its function and its powers. All right. The people who run the Fed, that is the Fed chairman and the Federal Open Market Committee, that group of people who are at the direction or direct the Fed's activities, they are nominated by the president and they are confirmed by Congress, okay? If any private corporation had that imposed on them, where the CEO or the chief executive had to be nominated by some politician, you'd all be screaming it was socialism or communism, all right? Secondly, the Fed has to, by law, turn over all of its profits to the U.S. Treasury, that is ostensibly us, the taxpayers, except that which it needs to operate, which is just a couple of percent of what it earns. All right, last year the Fed earned something like $100 billion, and it turned over almost all of that, with the exception, I think its budget is like $2 billion. Okay. If any corporation, private corporation, had that condition imposed on them, where they had to literally turn over, 98 or 99% of their profits, you'd be screaming socialism or communism. All right. So the Fed was created by Congress. Its directors are nominated by the president and confirmed by Congress. It is required to turn over all of its profits to the U.S. Treasury. That is ostensibly, like I said, us, the taxpayers, all right? So there you have three things right there. Congress can change the mandate. It could abolish the Fed. It could change it, whatever it wants about the Fed at any time, okay? It could expand its mandate or objectives. It could abolish it. It could do whatever it wants, all right? If a corporate entity had that imposed on it, you would say that's communism or socialism or who knows, fascism. I don't know. So you have that, all right? Now, some of you say, well, you're wrong, Mike, because the Fed is organized as a private corporation. Again, it is not. Its direction, the FOMC, again, they're all nominated and appointed by government officials, by politicians. And although the Fed member banks, let me explain something to you. The Fed only conducts business with certain banks. These banks have to be members of the Federal Reserve System. And basically, you're talking about the big major money center banks like JP Morgan and Citibank and Bank of America and Wells Fargo and these kinds of banks. There are a lot of banks in the country that are not part of the Federal Reserve System. They have account, and also savings and loans, which are not banks, or other financial institutions, finance companies, which are not banks. So what the Fed does, it works with its member banks. So in other words, some local community bank or a savings and loan would have an account at a commercial bank that is a member bank of the Federal Reserve System. And the Fed, in dealing with these smaller banks, does not deal directly. It will first credit or debit the account of the member bank. So let's say some little small community savings and loan sets up an account with JP Morgan Chase. JP Morgan Chase is a private institution, yes, but it is a member of the Federal Reserve System, all right? So if this little credit union wants to wire some money, or if it is receiving money, or if it is lending out money, what happens is in the accounting system of all that, the Fed will credit or debit the account of the member bank. That would be JP Morgan Chase. And then JP Morgan Chase would then credit or debit the account of its client, which would be that small credit union or community bank or whatever. So to say the Fed is set up as a private corporation, it's wrong. The Federal Reserve System is comprised of banks that are private corporations, and these are the entities that the Fed deals with directly, but the Fed itself is not a private corporation, all right? And that's all there is to it. It's part of the government. It was created by Congress. It gets its powers from Congress. Its leadership and direction committee, they're all nominated and appointed by politicians. It has to turn over all of its profits to the U.S. Treasury. I mean, come on. No private entity, no private business has these conditions imposed on it. All of you went crazy. I remember back in 2008 when the government bailed out General Motors. You were all going nuts that was socialism, all right? So here you have a situation where the Fed has to turn all of its profits over, where its leadership is decided by politicians, and you're still running around saying it's a private corporation. It is not. It is not even set up as a private corporation, all right? It just has relationships with private banks within its system because it can't deal with everybody directly. It can't deal with me and you directly. We have accounts with our own banks, all right? And if the government is sending us let's say the government is sending you a Social Security check or a tax refund, all right? The Fed, the Treasury instructs the Fed to make that payment to you. It doesn't send it to you. It credits the member bank where you have an account, JP Morgan Chase or Citibank or Bank of America or Wells Fargo, and then Wells Fargo will credit your account, all right? So then its account at the Fed will be debited, your account gets credited. That's how it works. The Fed doesn't deal with everybody on an individual basis. It has a number of banks, institutions within its system that it deals with, and then those banks and institutions deal with everybody else. That's how it's set up. It's not a private corporation. Just because those banks in its system happen to be private corporations doesn't make the Federal Reserve a private corporation. It is not. End of story. I hope everybody understands this. Bye.